Samuel Winslow never sought trouble, but trouble had a way of finding men who refused to be controlled. He had spent most of his life in construction, building homes, businesses, and even the occasional high-rise, pouring his sweat and skill into structures meant to last. It was a profession that demanded patience and resilience, a field where precision determined whether a building would stand firm for decades or crumble under pressure. He had worked with stubborn materials, unpredictable weather, and impossible deadlines, but nothing had prepared him for the battle he was about to face in the seemingly quiet neighborhood his uncle had left him. When the house and land became his after his uncle's passing, he had seen it as an opportunity to finally slow down, enjoy the fruits of his labor, and retreat from the chaos of the world. He had imagined peace, privacy, and the satisfaction of maintaining a piece of property that had been in his family for years. The land wasn't just an asset, it was history, and he intended to treat it with the respect it deserved. What he hadn't accounted for was the relentless control of the local neighborhood association, a group that seemed to think it had a say in every square inch of land within its reach. He had known about the association before moving in, of course. He had heard the stories, the complaints from homeowners trapped in endless disputes over mailbox colors and acceptable lawn heights. But he had checked the records and confirmed that his uncle had never signed the property into their jurisdiction. His land was separate, legally excluded from their governance, and he had every reason to believe that meant he could live without interference. That assumption lasted exactly 1 week before Karen Benson appeared on his doorstep. Dressed in an immaculately pressed navy blazer and carrying a leather-bound folder, she had the air of someone accustomed to delivering verdicts rather than engaging in conversation. The kind of person who smiled only as a formality, whose every interaction was a calculation. She extended a hand, her grip firm but practiced, the kind of handshake designed to establish dominance rather than connection. "Mr. Winslow, I'm Karen Benson. I serve as the president of the neighborhood council, and I wanted to personally welcome you to the community." Samuel accepted the handshake out of politeness, though he already sensed where this was going. He had encountered her type before, people who believed authority was something inherent rather than given, who thought leadership meant control rather than service. He kept his expression neutral as she took a measured glance past him, her eyes scanning the property with barely concealed evaluation. The house, the truck in the driveway, the unfinished repairs along the fence line. She was making mental notes, cataloging potential violations in a set of rules he had never agreed to follow. "You have a beautiful home," she continued, though there was a hesitation before the word beautiful, as if she had debated using something less complimentary. "We take great pride in maintaining a certain standard in our neighborhood. It's part of what makes this community so desirable." Samuel nodded but said nothing, waiting for her to get to the point. People like Karen always had one. "We have a set of guidelines to help keep everything uniform, aesthetically pleasing, and beneficial for property values. I took the liberty of bringing you a copy." She pulled out a thick packet of documents from her folder, holding them out as if she were bestowing a gift rather than imposing a set of restrictions. Samuel didn't take them. "That won't be necessary. My property isn't under your association." For the first time, her polished demeanor faltered, though she recovered quickly, offering a light laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, I understand. Some of the older properties had different arrangements, but over time we've worked to ensure consistency. It makes things easier for everyone." "I prefer things the way they are," he said evenly. Her smile thinned. "I think you'll find that being part of the association has benefits. I think I'll manage." Silence stretched between them for a beat too long, her expression shifting from one of rehearsed charm to something harder, more assessing. Finally, she pushed the packet against his chest just enough that he had to take it or let it fall. "Well, if you change your mind, you know where to find me." She turned on her heel and walked away, the sharp click of her heels against the pavement the only sound between them. Samuel watched her go, then looked down at the documents in his hand. He flipped through a few pages, skimming the dense legal language, the exhaustive list of rules governing everything from acceptable paint colors to the number of vehicles allowed in a driveway. Without a second thought, he tossed the packet into the trash. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The first letter arrived within a week, tucked into his mailbox without postage. A formal notice stating that his lawn was in need of maintenance to comply with community standards. He ignored it. The second letter was more direct, reminding him that unauthorized modifications to the exterior of a home may result in fines. That one, too, went in the trash. When he stepped outside one morning to find two men in reflective vests walking the perimeter of his property with clipboards in hand, he decided ignoring the issue was no longer an option. "What do you think you're doing?" he called, striding toward them. One of the men, an older guy with a thin mustache, cleared his throat. "We're conducting a property line assessment, zoning compliance check." "On whose authority?" The man hesitated. The other one, younger, shifted uncomfortably. Samuel narrowed his eyes. "You working for the city?" Another pause. "Then we were asked to verify. Get off my property." The men didn't argue. They packed up their clipboards and left without another word. Later that day, he drove into town and pulled the zoning records himself. There had been no official request for a property line assessment, no scheduled compliance checks. Karen had sent them, hoping he wouldn't question it. 2 mornings later, he found a barricade blocking his driveway. A bright orange sign declared road closed for maintenance. No through traffic. No one else's driveway had been blocked. He walked down the street, stopping a few neighbors to ask if they had been notified about road work. Most of them avoided his gaze, their answers vague, uncomfortable. Finally, an older man muttered. Karen mentioned something about new safety measures. Samuel went straight to her house. She answered the door with that same unreadable expression, but there was something smug in the way she tilted her head. "Mr. Winslow, what a surprise." "Move the barricade? Well, I'm afraid I don't have jurisdiction over road work." Her voice was light, practiced. "You'd have to take that up with the city. And I'm sure they'd tell me no maintenance was scheduled." "That's unfortunate." His patience snapped. He stepped forward, lowering his voice to something cold, firm. "Move." The damn barricade. She didn't flinch, but her chin lifted just slightly, her smile sharpening. "I'll see what I can do." Then, with a deliberate slowness, she closed the door in his face. That was when Samuel realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control, and Karen Benson wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. But if she thought he was going to roll over and let her dictate how he lived on his own land, she had another thing coming. Samuel Winslow had expected retaliation, but not as quickly and not as brazenly as it came. The barricade had been removed the day after his confrontation with Karen, but the message had been clear: this wasn't over. He had spent years dealing with stubborn project managers, greedy developers, and inspectors looking for reasons to delay a build, but this was different. This wasn't about codes or permits or bureaucratic nonsense. This was personal, and when people like Karen lost even a fraction of control, they didn't back down. They regrouped, recalculated, and came back harder. It started small. His mail began arriving late, sometimes not at all, which was strange because he had never had an issue with deliveries before. Then there was the garbage collection. His trash cans, left out like everyone else's, were mysteriously skipped on pickup day, forcing him to haul the bags into town himself or let them pile up. The neighbors' cans, lined neatly along the curb, were emptied without fail. He had called the Waste Management Service, but they claimed no record of any missed pickups for his address. One of the drivers, an older guy who clearly didn't want to get involved, had muttered something about changes to the service list before shrugging and driving off. It was a petty inconvenience, but that was exactly how these things started. Little irritations, easy to dismiss in isolation, but together they created a slow, grinding pressure meant to wear a person down. Then came the warnings. Not from the city, not from any official agency, but from the same unofficial channels Karen liked to use. A neatly folded notice tucked under his windshield wiper when he left the grocery store, stating that his exterior lighting may be in violation of residential brightness ordinances. A printed paper slipped into his mailbox, unsigned, reminding him that unregistered structures, including sheds, may be subject to removal. He had built the shed himself, sturdy and functional. And there wasn't a damn thing illegal about it. But that wasn't the point. The point was to make him question, to make him hesitate, to make him feel like he was being watched. The real escalation came one night just after midnight. Samuel had always been a light sleeper, a habit formed from years of early morning construction shifts and working on sites where heavy equipment rumbled at all hours. The sound that woke him wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something metallic against wood. He sat up, heart steady but alert, listening. The noise came again, somewhere outside, not forceful enough to be an accident. He moved silently to the window, careful not to trigger the floorboards, and peered out. His property was dark except for the motion-activated floodlight that illuminated the driveway, but beyond that, near the tree line, shadows moved where they shouldn't have. A flicker of motion, a quick shape slipping between the trunks, and then nothing. He didn't turn on any lights inside. He just grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand, slipped on his boots, and stepped outside, his movements calm, controlled. If whoever was out there thought they could intimidate him, they had chosen the wrong target. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the woods dense and silent aside from the occasional rustling of leaves. He scanned the perimeter of the house, his grip firm around the flashlight's handle, and that was when he saw the side gate, which he had bolted shut just before bed, was hanging open. The lock, an old but sturdy metal latch, was missing entirely, the screws scattered like discarded seeds on the ground beneath it. Someone had been here, and they hadn't just been passing through. His pulse remained steady, but his mind sharpened. He followed the faint disturbances in the grass, the subtle imprints of footsteps leading toward the back of the property. His floodlights hadn't caught them, which meant they had either known how to avoid the sensors or had moved carefully enough to stay just beyond their reach. That meant planning. That meant intent. He crouched, tracing a hand over the ground where the footsteps seemed to double back, and that was when he found it, a small metal stake, half buried in the soil, with a strip of fluorescent tape wrapped around the top. Survey markers. Someone had been marking his land. By the time dawn broke, Samuel had already dismantled the markers, pocketed the remnants, and checked every inch of his property for signs of further intrusion. The discovery didn't surprise him, but it confirmed something he had suspected from the beginning. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce rules. She was trying to push him out. That morning, he paid a visit to the county records office, walking through the front doors with the quiet determination of a man who wasn't there to waste time. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up as she asked how she could help, but when he mentioned his address, something flickered in her expression, a brief hesitation before she forced a neutral smile. "I'd like to see any recent filings or changes regarding property boundaries in my area," he said, keeping his tone polite but firm. The woman clicked away at her keyboard, her brow furrowing slightly. "There was a request submitted 2 weeks ago. It's still under review." Samuel's jaw tightened. A request for what? To incorporate several properties into the neighborhood's governing jurisdiction. It wasn't unexpected, but hearing it confirmed was like having a door slam shut in his mind, closing off any doubt about what was happening. And who submitted it? She hesitated again, her fingers tapping against the desk as if debating whether to answer. "I don't think I'm supposed to give out that information without a formal inquiry." Samuel exhaled slowly. "Let me guess. Karen Benson." The woman didn't nod, but the way she shifted in her chair told him everything he needed to know. He left the office without another word, his next destination already clear. Karen's house was exactly what he had expected: pristine, symmetrical, every flower bed perfectly manicured, every inch of the exterior a statement of controlled perfection. He didn't bother with pleasantries when she opened the door, didn't wait for the fake smile or the carefully worded greeting. "I know what you're trying to do," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with finality. Karen tilted her head slightly, the corners of her mouth curving just enough to suggest amusement. "And what exactly am I trying to do, Mr. Winslow?" "Claim my land." "Push me out." He stepped forward, closing the distance just enough that she had to tilt her chin to meet his gaze. "It's not going to work." She didn't flinch, but he could see at the smallest flicker of tension in her jaw, the almost imperceptible inhale as she recalculated her approach. "I think you're misunderstanding the situation." "No, I understand it just fine. I found the survey markers. I spoke to the county. I know about the request to annex my land." She smiled then, slow and deliberate. "You really should have taken the packet I gave you, Samuel. It would have saved you some trouble." He clenched his jaw. "This is the last time I'm going to say it. Stay off my property." Karen let out a small, amused sigh, stepping back just enough to rest a hand against the doorframe. "You can make this difficult if you want, but one way or another we like to keep things uniform around here." She shut the door before he could respond, but it didn't matter. The line had already been drawn, and he had no intention of backing down. If Karen wanted a fight, she had just found one. Samuel Winslow had dealt with stubborn men before, developers who refused to admit when their designs were structurally unsound, project managers who insisted on cutting corners to save costs, bureaucrats who sat behind desks and buried problems in paperwork rather than facing them head-on. He had spent decades navigating those conflicts with a quiet, deliberate patience, knowing that the best way to beat someone who thrived on control was to deny them the reaction they were looking for. But Karen Benson was different. She wasn't a businessman or a bureaucrat. She was a zealot, the kind of person who believed rules weren't just guidelines but a divine mandate, and that she alone had the right to enforce them. She wasn't just trying to make his life difficult, she was trying to drive him out. The day after their confrontation, Samuel woke to find a red tag nailed to the fence post at the edge of his driveway. Notice of code violation. The words were printed in bold, aggressive letters with a list of infractions below that made less and less sense the longer he read. Overgrown vegetation obstructing visibility, improper waste disposal, unauthorized structures exceeding permitted square footage. Every claim was either fabricated or twisted beyond recognition. His lawn was neatly trimmed, his trash properly contained, and his shed well within legal limits. But that wasn't the point. The point was to bury him under enough bureaucratic nonsense that he either exhausted himself fighting it or accepted that resistance was futile. He didn't bother calling the number listed on the notice. Instead, he went straight to the county office and requested the official records of every complaint filed against his property. The clerk, a tired-looking man in his 50s, handed him a thin stack of papers. Most of them had been submitted within the past 72 hours. All of them originated from the same source, Karen Benson. Samuel exhaled slowly, flipping through the documents with the practiced eye of someone used to reading between the lines. There were no supporting photographs, no cited ordinances beyond vague references to community standards. It was harassment dressed up as regulation. But what caught his attention wasn't the complaints themselves, it was the final page, a formal request from the neighborhood council asking for an expedited hearing regarding a history of non-compliance on his property. The date was already set, 2 days from now. No notification, no opportunity for response. Just a meeting where he would be judged by the same people trying to force him out. He left the office without another word and drove back home, his hands steady on the wheel but his mind calculating the next move. The hearing was a setup. If he walked in unprepared, they would overwhelm him with fabricated violations, impose ridiculous penalties, and make it clear that his presence was unwelcome. If he refused to show up, they would take that as an admission of guilt and escalate further. Either way, Karen would get what she wanted, an excuse to tighten the noose. He spent the next 48 hours preparing. He pulled the original deed from his files, highlighting every clause that confirmed his property's exclusion from the neighborhood council's authority. He documented every interaction he had with Karen, every notice he had received, every attempt she had made to undermine his ownership. He took time-stamped photographs of his lawn, his shed, his trash bins, and the surrounding area to counter any fabricated claims. He compiled a copy of the county's official zoning map, marking the exact boundaries of his land. By the time he was done, he had built the kind of case that didn't just refute accusations, it exposed the people behind them. The hearing was held in the community center, a sterile room with beige walls and a long table where 5 council members sat like magistrates presiding over a trial. Karen was seated in the center, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. The other members, 2 men and 2 women, looked less certain, their eyes flicking between him and the stack of papers in front of them. "Mr. Winslow," Karen began, her tone carefully measured, "we appreciate you taking the time to address these concerns. As you know, maintaining a cohesive and well-regulated community is essential for the safety and well-being of all residents. Samuel said nothing. He simply placed his own stack of documents on the table in front of him, the thick folder making a satisfying thud as it landed. Karen's smile didn't waver, but there was a slight shift in her demeanor, a flicker of something behind her eyes that told him she had expected him to come unarmed. There have been multiple complaints regarding your property, she continued, gesturing to the papers in front of her. Our records indicate a pattern of non-compliance that has raised concerns among residents. Samuel leaned forward slightly. Which residents? Karen blinked. Excuse me, the complaints. They're all signed by you. He slid one of the documents toward her. So when you say concerns among residents, what you actually mean is concerns from Karen Benson. A murmur passed between the other members, but Karen didn't flinch. As president of the council, it is my duty to uphold community standards. You don't have jurisdiction over my property, Samuel cut in, his voice steady. He reached into his folder, pulling out the highlighted deed. This land was never part of your association. My uncle opted out when this neighborhood was first developed. That hasn't changed. One of the other council members, a man in his 60s with a thinning hairline, adjusted his glasses. We recently submitted a request to update the community map, ensuring all properties within our established boundaries fall under the same regulations. This is standard procedure. Samuel slid another document across the table. According to the county office, that request is still under review. Until it's approved, which it won't be, you have no legal authority over my land. Karen's jaw tightened. Regardless of jurisdiction, Mr. Winslow, there are still concerns about the condition of your property. Samuel pulled out the time-stamped photographs. My lawn is cut, my trash is contained, and my shed is within zoning requirements. Every violation you've cited is either exaggerated or outright fabricated. The room fell into silence. One of the women shifted uncomfortably in her chair, exchanging a glance with the others. Karen folded her hands. If you're unwilling to work with us, there may be consequences beyond simple fines. Samuel met her gaze without blinking. Is that a threat? She smiled, slow and deliberate. Of course not, just a warning. It would be unfortunate if future concerns had to be escalated. The meeting adjourned without a ruling. No fines were issued, no penalties enforced, but Samuel knew better than to assume that meant victory. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat, she was the type to change tactics. That night, he installed motion sensors along his fence line and reinforced the locks on every door and gate. He wasn't paranoid, but he wasn't naive either. When people like Karen felt power slipping, they didn't just let go. They found other ways to take control. The next morning, as he stepped outside to collect his mail, he noticed something: new tire tracks in the damp soil near the back of his property, leading to a spot where the grass had been disturbed, as if something had been dug up and then hastily covered again. Someone had been here, and whatever they were looking for, they weren't done yet. Samuel Winslow had always believed that when someone pushed, you either stood your ground or got out of the way. He had never been the type to retreat, but he also wasn't reckless. He knew when a situation called for force and when it called for patience. Up until now, he had been playing the game on Karen Benson's terms, responding to her provocations, refuting her false claims, dismantling her attempts to tighten the noose around his property. But the discovery of the tire tracks behind his land changed everything. This was no longer just about fines, notices, or petty inconveniences. Someone had been trespassing, and whatever they had been looking for, they had been careful enough to cover their tracks, just not careful enough to erase them completely. That meant they were confident, maybe even arrogant, and that meant they would be back. The realization settled deep in his gut, cold and unwavering. If they wanted to turn this into something more than a bureaucratic war, then fine. But they weren't going to like how he fought back. He didn't bother calling the sheriff's department because he already knew how that would go. If the officer who had dismissed the vandalism of his fence was any indication, he would get a lot of half-hearted reassurances and little actual action. He wasn't interested in playing along with a system designed to wear people down into submission. Instead, he spent the day methodically reinforcing the perimeter of his land, not in a way that made it obvious he was expecting trouble, but subtly adjusting the angles of his motion sensor lights, calibrating the trail cameras he had mounted on the trees bordering his property, ensuring that if someone tried sneaking around again, they wouldn't be able to do so unnoticed. He wasn't just looking to catch them in the act. He wanted to know who they were and, more importantly, why they were so interested in a piece of land that legally didn't belong to them. The following night, long after the neighborhood had gone quiet and the last porch lights had flickered out, Samuel sat on his back porch, waiting. He didn't turn on any lights, didn't make any sudden movements, just sat there nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the woods beyond his property. It was almost peaceful in its own way, the rhythmic chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the brush. But beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of tension, a sensation that had nothing to do with the night itself and everything to do with the knowledge that somewhere out there, someone was watching, waiting, testing the limits of what they could get away with. He wasn't sure how long he sat there before he saw a flicker of movement just beyond the tree line, subtle enough that if he hadn't been expecting it, he might have dismissed it as nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was deliberate. Samuel didn't react right away. He didn't want to spook them, didn't want to give them a reason to retreat before he had a chance to see what they were after. He remained perfectly still, barely breathing, as the figure crept closer, staying low to the ground, clearly trying to avoid detection. Even in the dim light, he could make out the faint gleam of something metallic in their hand, not a weapon, but a tool. A crowbar. That was interesting. That meant they weren't just snooping. They were planning to take something. He waited until they were close enough that he could see the outline of their face. Then he moved. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to let them know they had been seen. The reaction was immediate. The figure froze, then turned and bolted back toward the trees. Samuel didn't chase them, there was no point. He had already gotten what he needed. He had seen them clearly enough to know they weren't just some neighborhood delinquent messing around where they didn't belong. This was an adult, someone who knew what they were doing, someone who had likely been here before. By the time morning rolled around, Samuel had already pulled the footage from his trail cameras, reviewing every frame with meticulous attention to detail. The image quality wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. The man was in his 40s, lean but strong, dressed in dark clothing, face partially obscured by a cap. Not someone he recognized, but not just some random stranger either. This had been planned. He considered his next move carefully. He could confront Karen directly, shove the images in her face, demand answers. But that wouldn't get him what he needed. If she was behind this, and he was nearly certain she was, then she would just deny it, feign ignorance, maybe even act offended that he would dare accuse her of something so outrageous. No, if he wanted the truth, he would have to come at this from another angle. He spent the day making calls, reaching out to people who actually would take this kind of intrusion seriously. It took some persistence, but eventually he got through to a county official who was more than willing to confirm an interesting piece of information. Karen's request to have his land annexed into the neighborhood's jurisdiction had not been approved. In fact, it had been denied, citing lack of legal grounds. That should have been the end of it. Should have meant that all of this nonsense, all of Karen's posturing, all of the fabricated violations and bogus complaints had been for nothing. And yet, here he was, dealing with a trespasser who had clearly been sent to dig for something. Which meant Karen was playing an entirely different game. That night, he returned the favor. He didn't break into her house, didn't trespass onto her land, but he made sure she knew he was watching. He parked his truck just outside her pristine, regulation-approved driveway and waited. Not for long, just enough time to see the curtain in her front window twitch, just enough time to see the unmistakable flicker of annoyance cross her face when she finally stepped outside and saw him sitting there. He didn't say anything, didn't make any move to approach her. He just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the weight of his presence speak for itself. She was used to controlling the narrative, to setting the terms of engagement. He was letting her know those days were over. After a long, tense moment, Karen walked down her front steps and stopped just short of his truck, arms folded. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Winslow?" He tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. Thought I'd return the courtesy. You seem real interested in my property. Figured I'd take an interest in yours. Her expression barely flickered, but he saw it, that brief, involuntary flicker of irritation, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. If you have a legitimate concern, I'd be happy to discuss it through the proper channels. He smiled, slow and deliberate. Funny. That's exactly what I was thinking. She didn't break eye contact, but she didn't look as confident as she had before. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected this, and that was exactly what he wanted. He wasn't just pushing back anymore. He was forcing her to react, to make a mistake, because one thing he knew better than most was that people like Karen always made mistakes. They got comfortable, got arrogant, thought they had everything under control right up until the moment they didn't. And that was when they started to fall apart. As he drove away, he didn't need to look in the mirror to know she was still standing there watching. Letter. This was far from over. Samuel had expected Karen to retaliate, but even he had underestimated how far she was willing to go. The night after he had parked outside her house, she had tried to play it cool, but he had seen it in her face, that flicker of uncertainty, that moment where she realized she no longer had complete control of the situation. He had hoped that would be enough to make her rethink whatever she was planning, but he had been wrong. Karen wasn't the type to retreat when challenged. She was the type to double down, to escalate in ways that were meant to force submission rather than resolve anything. And that was exactly what she did. The first sign came the next morning. Samuel had gone out to check his mailbox, half expecting another notice, another fabricated violation, another thinly veiled attempt to assert dominance, but instead there was nothing. His mailbox was gone. Not vandalized, not damaged, just gone. The post, the box itself, everything had been removed as if it had never existed. He stood there for a moment, staring at the empty patch of dirt where it had once been, then scanned the street. The other mailboxes stood untouched, lined up neatly in front of their respective homes. His was the only one missing. He turned on his heel and walked back inside, pulling out his phone. He didn't bother calling Karen directly. There was no point in giving her the satisfaction of a confrontation she had orchestrated. Instead, he called the post office. After sitting through a maze of automated menus, he finally got a human on the line, a woman who sounded disinterested until he mentioned his address. Then there was a brief pause before she cleared her throat and said, "Your mailbox was reported as a violation of community standards. It was removed under request from the neighborhood council." Samuel exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. Under whose authority? There was another pause. It was filed as a community safety concern. Of course it was. He didn't bother arguing. There was no point in wasting energy fighting a battle with someone who had clearly already decided they weren't going to help him. He thanked her, hung up, and drove straight to the hardware store. By the end of the afternoon, he had installed a new mailbox, this time reinforced, cemented into the ground, the kind that wasn't going anywhere without heavy machinery. He had half a mind to install a camera on it just to watch Karen's reaction the next time she passed by. But the mailbox was just the beginning. That night, long after the neighborhood had gone quiet, Samuel was woken by a sound that set every instinct in his body on edge. It wasn't the usual ambient noise of the woods or the distant hum of passing cars. It was closer, deliberate, the crunch of gravel beneath slow, measured footsteps. He didn't move right away, forcing himself to listen, to assess. The sound was coming from the side of the house, near the shed, where the motion lights should have triggered but hadn't. That alone told him something was wrong. Either the lights had been disabled, or someone had found a way to avoid their sensors. He moved carefully, reaching for the heavy flashlight on his nightstand before making his way toward the back door. He didn't turn on any lights inside the house, no need to announce that he was awake. Instead, he eased open the door just enough to step out onto the porch, the night air cool against his skin as he scanned the darkness. The silence was thick, suffocating, and then movement. A shadow detached itself from the tree line, a figure slipping toward the shed with the kind of confidence that suggested they had been here before. Samuel didn't hesitate. He stepped off the porch, boots hitting the ground with deliberate weight, and flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, catching the figure mid-step. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a hood. The second the light hit him, he froze, then turned and bolted without hesitation, disappearing back into the trees before Samuel could get a better look. He stood there for a long moment, heart steady but mind racing. The shed. They had been after the shed. By the time he reached it, the lock was already broken, the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open the rest of the way, scanning the interior. Nothing seemed out of place. His tools were still there, his supplies untouched. But then he noticed the floorboards near the back, slightly disturbed, as if someone had been trying to pry them up. His stomach tightened. The next morning he took a closer look, carefully prying up the boards himself. At first there was nothing but packed dirt beneath them, the scent of aged wood and earth filling the air. But as he dug deeper, his fingers brushed against something solid. He pulled it free, brushing away the dust, and frowned. A rusted metal box, about the size of a shoebox, its edges corroded with age. It was locked, but the lock was weak, brittle from years of neglect. It took barely any effort to snap it open. Inside were papers, old and yellowed with time, the ink faded but still legible. Samuel skimmed the first page and immediately understood why someone had been trying to get to this. Property records, documents dating back decades, and at the top of one of them, a name he recognized instantly: Karen Benson's father. He exhaled slowly, piecing it together. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about enforcing community rules. This was about something deeper, something buried in the history of this neighborhood. And Karen, for all her arrogance and control, was trying to keep it from coming to light. By midday, he had made copies of every document and stored them in multiple locations. He wasn't stupid. He knew this changed everything. Karen had already been willing to resort to petty harassment and legal manipulation to force him out. If she realized he had these records, she would escalate even further. That night he installed more cameras, more motion sensors, reinforcing every vulnerable point on his property. He wasn't just defending his home anymore. He was preparing for war. The next morning, Karen showed up at his house. She didn't knock. She didn't smile. She just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for him to acknowledge her. Samuel took his time opening the door. He leaned against the frame, arms loose at his sides, watching her carefully. Something you need. Her expression was tight, controlled, but her eyes betrayed her. We need to talk. He raised an eyebrow. About what? She hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for him to know she was choosing her words carefully. I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. Samuel let out a slow breath, shaking his head. You don't get to play that card now. Karen's jaw tensed. I don't know what you think you're doing, but this isn't a game. He studied her, waiting, watching. Then he smiled. No, it's not. For the first time, she looked uncertain. And that, more than anything, told him that she had finally realized the truth. She wasn't in control anymore, and she never would be again. Samuel Winslow had never considered himself a patient man, but he understood the value of timing. There were moments when striking first was the only option, and there were moments when letting an opponent dig their own grave was the smarter move. Karen Benson had spent weeks trying to force him into submission, escalating her tactics from petty inconveniences to outright trespassing, all in the belief that he would eventually cave. But she had made a mistake. She had pushed too far, too fast, without realizing that the more she pressed, the more careful he became. She thought she had been pulling the strings, but now the balance had shifted, and she was too blinded by arrogance to see it. When she had shown up at his door, her carefully rehearsed mask slipping for the first time, Samuel had seen the truth in her eyes. She was nervous. Not afraid, not yet, but aware that she had lost control of the situation. And if there was one thing people like Karen hated, it was the realization that someone had taken away their power without them noticing. He hadn't let her inside, hadn't given her the satisfaction of a private conversation where she could manipulate the narrative. Instead, he had let her stand there, exposed, vulnerable, every forced word of civility a wasted effort. She had left after only a few minutes, jaw tight, shoulders squared, walking with the kind of rigid posture that suggested she was barely holding herself together. That had been the moment Samuel knew she had made her final move, and now it was his turn. The next day he drove into town, stopping by the county records office first. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as he approached, but the moment he slid the copies of the documents across the desk, her posture changed. It wasn't every day that someone came in with property records old enough to predate most of the houses in the neighborhood, and certainly not with paperwork that connected to names still holding power in the community. He didn't say much, just told her he wanted an official verification of the document's authenticity. She hesitated, clearly uncertain whether she wanted to be involved, but in the end, rules were rules. She took the papers, made a few calls, and within the hour she confirmed what he already knew. The records were real. They weren't just old survey documents or irrelevant zoning files, they were evidence of fraudulent land transfers, forged agreements, and signatures from people who had either been dead at the time of signing or had never legally owned the properties in question. Karen's father's name was on almost all of them. Samuel didn't waste time. He left the records office and made his next stop the office of a local attorney he had worked with years ago on a construction project gone sideways. The man was sharp, no nonsense, and most importantly, not the type to be intimidated by community politics. He looked over the documents, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to cold calculation as he flipped through the pages. By the time he was done, he let out a low breath and leaned back in his chair, studying Samuel with new interest. "You know what you have here." Samuel nodded. "Enough to burn down everything Karen's built." The lawyer exhaled sharply through his nose. "More than that. This isn't just her. This is years of illegal dealings, buried under layers of fake approvals and rewritten property lines. If this gets out, if the right people see it, there's going to be an investigation." "Good," Samuel said. "That's exactly what I want." The lawyer gave him a long, assessing look, then nodded. "I can make some calls. But once this starts, it won't be quiet. You ready for that?" Samuel smiled, slow and deliberate. "I've been ready for a while." 2 days later, the first cracks in Karen's foundation began to show. It started small, an anonymous tip to a local journalist, a quiet conversation between the lawyer and a county official who had been looking for an excuse to go after the neighborhood board for years. Then came the subpoenas, the sudden scrutiny of property transactions that had been ignored for decades, the whispered speculation that spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Samuel didn't need to say a word. He just sat back and watched as Karen's carefully constructed empire started to crumble. She tried to contain it at first, insisting that it was all a misunderstanding, that the records were outdated, irrelevant, taken out of context. But the panic in her voice betrayed her. The more she denied, the more people started to question why she was so desperate to make it go away. Then, just when it seemed like she might manage to spin the narrative in her favor, the final blow came. A former member of the neighborhood board, a man who had resigned years ago under vague circumstances, came forward. He had seen the records, recognized the names, and decided that he wasn't going to go down with the sinking ship. In a carefully worded statement, he admitted that he had been pressured into signing documents he hadn't fully understood, that Karen's father had orchestrated multiple fraudulent acquisitions, and that Karen herself had continued the practice long after she had taken over. It was the kind of confession that couldn't be ignored. Within hours, Karen went from a respected community leader to a woman drowning in legal threats. She tried to fight back, but the walls were closing in too fast, the weight of decades of corruption finally crushing her beneath it. By the time the official investigation was announced, she had no more moves left to play. Samuel heard about her resignation the same way everyone else did, through a terse, impersonal email sent to every resident in the neighborhood. No apologies, no explanations, just a cold acknowledgement that she was stepping down for personal reasons. He almost laughed when he read it. Even in defeat, she couldn't bring herself to admit she had lost. That night, for the first time since all of this had started, he slept soundly. The war was over, and he had won. The neighborhood felt different in the days following Karen Benson's resignation. It wasn't just the absence of her constant presence, the way she had once inserted herself into every conversation, every dispute, every minor aesthetic decision about the houses and lawns around her. It was something deeper, something less tangible but just as real, the slow unraveling of an atmosphere of control that had been carefully cultivated over years. The weight that had pressed down on everyone, the unspoken expectation that certain rules could never be questioned, was suddenly gone. And in its place, something new was taking root. A hesitation. A sense of uncertainty. For the first time in a long time, people were beginning to realize that the authority they had lived under hadn't been as absolute as they had believed. Samuel saw it in the way his neighbors acted now, the way they hesitated before speaking to him, as if unsure whether they owed him gratitude or resentment. He hadn't set out to be anyone's hero, hadn't cared whether people thought of him as the man who had finally broken Karen's hold on the community. But now, whenever he walked to his truck in the morning or worked outside, there was always someone nearby, lingering just long enough that he could feel their eyes on him. Some nodded in acknowledgement, others simply avoided him altogether, pretending they had never bought into Karen's rhetoric, had never gone along with her campaign against him. He had expected that. People had short memories when it came to their own complicity. The official fallout came swiftly. Investigations into fraudulent property transactions took on a life of their own, reaching back further than even Samuel had anticipated. What had started as a focused look into Karen's manipulation of neighborhood governance quickly expanded into something far larger, a web of deals that extended into county offices, land use committees, and even local banks. Properties that had mysteriously changed hands, permits that had been fast-tracked without oversight, zoning changes that had benefited a select few while forcing others out. Karen had been a key player, but she hadn't acted alone. When the subpoenas started rolling in, names Samuel had never even heard before began surfacing, people who had operated comfortably in the shadows, never expecting to be questioned. Some denied involvement, some claimed ignorance, but a few started to talk, desperate to save themselves from whatever legal storm was coming. And Karen disappeared. Not literally, she was still in her house, still pretending that she was simply taking a step back to focus on personal matters, but the woman who had once ruled the neighborhood with an iron grip was gone. The Karen Benson who had walked around as if she owned every square inch of the community, who had spoken with absolute certainty in every conversation, who had wielded her influence like a weapon, had been reduced to a ghost. Samuel saw her once, about a week after her resignation, standing at the end of her driveway as he drove past. She wasn't dressed in her usual perfectly coordinated outfits, wasn't carrying her ever-present leather folder filled with notices and violations. She just stood there, arms crossed, gaze distant, watching as the world moved on without her. She saw him as he passed, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't do anything but hold her gaze long enough to make it clear that he knew exactly what she had lost. Then he kept driving. Over the next few weeks, the changes became more noticeable. The neighborhood board, once a tightly controlled extension of Karen's will, fractured into uncertainty. Some of the remaining members resigned outright, wanting no part in whatever mess was still unfolding. Others tried to hold things together, to maintain some semblance of order, but without their leader, they were exposed for what they were: people who had followed, not led. New voices started emerging, homeowners who had never spoken up before now realizing they had a say in how their community was run. It was a slow process, but Samuel could see the shift happening, the way people were beginning to question things they had once accepted without thought. For him, though, the fight was over. He had never wanted to be part of any of this. He hadn't moved here to change the neighborhood or to become some kind of local legend. He had just wanted to live his life, to enjoy the home his uncle had left him without interference. And now, finally, that was exactly what he could do. The morning he received official confirmation that his land would remain legally separate from the neighborhood's jurisdiction, he didn't feel triumph, just relief. The battle had been fought, the lines had been drawn, and he had won. Not through brute force, not through intimidation, but by doing what Karen had never expected, standing his ground, refusing to be bullied, and exposing the truth she had spent years trying to bury. On a quiet afternoon, as he sat on his porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, a familiar car pulled up in front of his house. He recognized the driver immediately, one of the board members who had remained silent through most of the hearings, a man who had never spoken against Karen but had also never gone out of his way to enforce her will. The man hesitated before stepping out, adjusting his glasses as he approached the porch. Samuel didn't move, didn't say anything, just waited. "I wanted to," the man cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "I just wanted to say, things are changing. People are talking about making real adjustments, not just maintaining the same system we had before. And well, I guess some of us just wanted to say that maybe we should have spoken up sooner." Samuel studied him for a long moment, then exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, maybe you should have." The man flinched slightly, as if he had been expecting that but still wasn't prepared to hear it out loud. He nodded, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "Still, I figured you should know." Samuel didn't reply, and after a few seconds the man turned and walked back to his car, driving away without another word. As the dust finally settled, as the last remnants of Karen's influence faded into the background, Samuel found himself returning to the life he had intended to build here. The repairs on his house continued, the land was maintained the way he wanted it, without interference, without the constant threat of some manufactured rule hanging over his head. The nights were peaceful again, the only sounds those of nature, not the subtle undercurrent of tension that had once gripped the neighborhood. One evening, as he locked up his tools after another long day of work, he paused for a moment, taking in the quiet. No letters in the mailbox, no signs mysteriously appearing in his yard, no unwanted visitors lurking near his property line. Just the land, the house, the fading light of day. And for the first time in a long time, Samuel Winslow allowed himself to truly relax. The war was over, and he had won.